All right, hello and welcome to the webinar. This is the first in a series for 2012. Our topic today is cropping the big picture, determining what the new meta-analysis means for your mentoring program. Just a little bit more about this collaboration we're really excited about. The Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota, I'm April Reardon, the Director of Training and Community Partnerships here at the Mentoring Partnership of Minnesota, and excited to be teaming up with organizations like these listed, Education Northwest, Friends for Youth, Oregon Mentors. We've got Mike, Celeste, and Sarah helping out with this one, but working together in the coming year to deliver this monthly series for mentoring professionals. Many of us were offering free webinars or webinar series independently. That Minnesota had the Research and Action series, then the Quality and Action series for a couple of years. Friends for Youth had a monthly series, and we worked together at different times. But anyway, notice we were attracting participants from all over the country, much like today. Today we have over 150 participants registered, and we'll see how many we actually have participating then too. But anyway, so we started talking and decided to join forces so we could offer what we hope will be one really great webinar series, open to and geared toward all mentoring professionals throughout the country and even beyond. Each quarter, we plan to feature webinars focused on, so each quarter, 1 month will be focused on mentoring practice. 1 month would be focused on mentoring research like today, and another month will be focused on highlights of innovative practices or innovative programming ideas from the mentoring field. I'll mention in a minute that we have a survey at the end, but we welcome all of your suggestions and really hope that by combining all of our individual efforts and our collective wisdom, we'll be able to deliver even better webinars to a wider audience throughout the year. We do look forward to involving other partners in the coming months. We know for sure that Mentor Michigan and the Massachusetts Mentoring Partnership will be involved, and welcome help from others as well. So third Thursday of every month, we hope to see you here each and every time. And thank you. It's just been such a pleasure to work on this first one with Mike and Celeste and Sarah, and I look forward to working with all of you in the future again. So we're
excited too.
Yay! Thanks, Sarah. We really hope that you'll participate in today's webinar. We really want this to be an interactive experience and a chance for you to really converse with the experts and your peers in the field of mentoring. So all attendees, you're muted now. We have such a huge group. Everybody is muted just for the best sound quality, but you can use this control panel. And let me just highlight for you to type questions and comments in the question box. So you can enter those questions. You do get an option of sending that question just to the organizers, and then we will decide if we're going to read your question aloud, or we might just type a response back to you, particularly if it's just a technical question. And you also have the option of, you can click something like this, where you can raise your hand to ask a question live during the webinar. And that works best if you have if you're participating on the phone, or if you have a headset connected to your computer so that you can talk to us over the web. So we have a couple of polls that we are going to check in on. Like I said, we wanted to know how many attendees are participating. So we know a lot of people will register once and might sit around a computer with some of their colleagues, and if you're not doing that, just know you can. And it might be that we have large groups of people participating in the webinar in different states and cities in the future, so as this continues to grow. But wanting to know how many attendees, so how many people are using this login or your registration at this point. And just give it a few seconds for people to vote. Looks like a lot of you are sitting alone today. We'll change that in the future. Now we know our baseline. All right, we've almost got everybody. I'm going to go ahead and close. Yeah, it looks like most people are sitting and participating with just one person on their on this registration. So 91% of you are all alone, and 8% have a couple people with you. So just an idea for the future that you could invite other people to participate with you. And if you need some guidance on that, just let us know. We have one more poll. We just want to see what our experience level is then. So just to click how you would describe your experience level in the field of mentoring. Helps us figure out who our audience is. All right, just going to give it a couple more seconds and I'll close and move on. See if any of my collaborators are surprised to know. Here we go. Excited to see we have some experts. We really hope to hear from you. Here's some hands raised and some questions and entered. You can enter some tough questions later. But 65% experienced and 12% of you are beginners. So we welcome all levels, but we do hope that the webinars will meet the needs of all of those groups, and sometimes might jump ahead of the beginners and because we only have this hour, but we'll provide resources along with the webinar so that you can get caught up later. That said, just something that's good to know is that all attendees after the webinar today will receive an email that includes a link to these slides, a link to an online recording of the webinar. We've had some glitches with converting those recordings, but I'm still hopeful, so I aspirationally include that here. But any resources that are linked within the slides and also anything that comes up during our discussion, then we'll include those in that email, and you'll also have contact information for our partners and for our panelists. And again, if you would please take the time at the end as you're exiting the webinar to just complete a short 5-question survey, you can really help us improve the series as we move along. So without further ado, I do want to, again, we have Sarah Kremer and Mike Geringer and Celeste Jansen with us. Celeste from Oregon, Mike with the National Mentoring Center, and Sarah with Friends for Youth. But we also have our esteemed panelists here. I just want to welcome Dr. David Dubois, who probably requires no introduction here, but to this audience, is a professor in the Division of Community Health Sciences within the School of Public Health at the University of Illinois in Chicago. David authored both meta-analyses that was part of an author of the meta-analyses that we're going to talk about today, and also the lead co-editor of the Handbook of Youth Mentoring, which I'm sure everyone has right at their desk, ready to open up. His research has received funding from several federal sources, including the Institutes of Health, OJJDP, Institute of Education Sciences. He recently completed a 2-year distinguished fellowship with the William T. Grant Foundation, but he consults widely to mentoring programs nationally, is a member of the Research and Policy Council of Mentor and the National Mentoring Partnership, and the Research Advisory Council of Big Brothers Big Sisters of America. Hopefully you're all signed up for this, but maybe we'll include the instructions in our follow-up email, but is the founder and moderator of a listserv on youth mentoring research and practice that currently has over 400 members. And probably most importantly has been a mentor himself in a Big Brothers Big Sisters program, and for the past 3 years has supervised a class that he developed in which undergraduate students serve as mentors. It's a mouthful. Thank you, David. Welcome. We're so glad you're able to participate today. And we also have with us Tom Keller, and Tom as the Duncan and Cindy Campbell Professor for Children, Youth, and Families in the Portland State University School of Social Work. Studies a wide array of mentoring programs and relationships. He has organized the annual Summer Institute for Youth Mentoring, which brings prominent researchers and experienced professionals who direct mentoring programs from around the country to PSU for a week of intensive discussion of what's working and what's not in the field of mentoring. And I think all of our partners here have been there and can probably attribute some of our, or a lot of our relationships and our desire to collaborate and bring research to programs from having been to the Summer Institute on Youth Mentoring. So we've often talked about how this webinar series is almost an extension, or so we envision it as an extension of that. So a lot of credit goes to Tom for the Summer Institute on Youth Mentoring. But Tom is also directing PSU's new Center for Interdisciplinary Mentoring Research, bringing together faculty from social work, sociology, psychology, business administration, computer science, and other departments around campus to collaborate on new directions for research on mentoring. And you see that evidence of that at the Summer Institute. I think I've established your credibility here as our panelists, and I'm going to switch over to Celeste to do an introduction here, but we look forward to this conversation and have all kinds of tough questions for both of you. Thank you so much for being here.
Okay, good morning, everyone. When the collaborators of this webinar were planning for today, we decided we wanted to do more than just simply review the contents of that published meta-analysis. We really want to dig into some broader, bigger questions. So we advised all of you listening to pre-read the meta-analysis and come with questions in mind. However, we also acknowledged it would be probably a great idea to start with a brief overview of the meta-analysis to really get everyone on the same page. So for the next few minutes, I'll briefly walk you through the findings. Before we launch into the 2011 meta-analysis, remember that this is actually the second time that David Dubois has published a mentoring meta-analysis. The first study was published in 2002, and the citation is up on the screen, as well as the two primary findings. It looks like we're beginning a poll because we'd like to find out what is your understanding of a meta-analysis. So if you could please select one of the four options.
We had experienced and experts in the field, so it should be interesting to see how this lines up. It looks pretty good. Almost everybody has voted. I will close here in just a second. Okay, let's see what we've got. Looks pretty good. Pretty good understanding of what a meta-analysis is, but there's a, so the crowd is correct. 79% of that existing evidence combined and analyzed for trends. But for those of you who selected the evaluation of a program that includes a control group, or I have no idea, I admire the people who just were honest and said I have no idea what a meta-analysis is. Good for you. You know, but don't feel bad if you weren't sure, because if you haven't spent a lot of time with it, I think you'll figure it out through the course of this webinar. But knowing that most of us understand it, again, that's where those resources will be available, and you'll figure it out as we go along. But we won't spend a bunch of time talking about it then. All right. Sorry, Celeste.
Great. No, thank you, April. So if we can see the slide. Great. Okay, so going back to 2002, the two primary findings are up on the screen in the blue box. And this is just a reminder that Dubois' first meta-analysis really is one of the most important studies in our field. And that second finding, linking positive outcomes to best practices, really resonated and drives a lot of the work we do to enhance quality. So now let's look at the 2011 meta-analysis. This most recent study was just recently published at the end of last year. It reviewed 73 independent evaluations. And for those of you who chose that meta-analysis as something that has a control group, what David and his colleagues did was actually look at 73 independent evaluations that all had control or comparison groups. And all of those studies dated between 1999 and 2010. So in this article, the authors spend quite a lot of time explaining the Rhodes model of youth mentoring, and we're going to pull that up on the screen. Dr. Jean Rhodes published this model 9 years ago, yet it was closely tied to the current meta-analysis, And here's why. In the box on the left, we see positive outcomes. And Dr. Rose explains that those are greatly affected by moderators, which are all the things in the boxes at the bottom. So things like interpersonal history or social competencies all have an effect on the positive outcomes that youth experience. So in this new meta-analysis, Dr. Dubois and his colleagues looked at each one of those moderators at the bottom, and they broke each one into a bunch of different variables, and then they looked at every single study and tried to find if those variables were in them and coded them. So here's a great example. For instance, for youth interpersonal history, all the different things that the variables might be that could be found in the separate studies. So if the variable wasn't in the original study, it couldn't be calculated in the meta-analysis. So based on all of this data and looking at all the different variables in the 73 different studies, let's take a look at what those findings were.
Sorry.
Okay, so there are 3 different ways we're going to look at the findings. First of all, let's take a look at the good news box. Number 1, mentoring works by it positively affecting kids in multiple areas. So David Dubois and his colleagues saw that the studies found improvements in behavioral, social, emotional, and academic areas. Number 2, a single program can have a positive effect in more than one area. This is a really interesting idea. Even if you're trying to target, let's say, a behavioral change, not just the behavior is affected. There might be other areas that are also affected, like something social or emotional. Number 3, for those of you that have heard Dr. Karcher speak about effect sizes, you know why effect sizes are so important. In this meta-analysis, we see that mentoring's effect size is right where we'd expect it to be. It's really similar to the effect size found in the 2002 meta-analysis, and it's really in line with other youth interventions that are out there in the field. Number 4, mentoring is both a prevention tool that can prevent negative outcomes, but it also is a positive tool that can really help increase positive improvement. So it's both prevention and promotion. And number 5, finally, in this study, Dr. Dubois looks at both traditional and non-traditional mentoring programs. So non-traditional, I mean peer mentoring programs or group mentoring programs or other programs that just look slightly different than what we see as a traditional program. He found that overall mentoring was really found to be broad and flexible, and that many positive outcomes can be associated with non-traditional types as well as traditional types of mentoring. So now let's take a look at the more challenging news. First of all, the similar effect size between the first time that he did the meta-analysis and the second time he did the meta-analysis was interpreted by the authors to mean that we're really not seeing a lot of big changes in the field, and specifically no evidence of improvement. Also, let's look at number 2 and number 3. Now these are both pretty similar in that they both talk about the lack of data. So if that data and those variables weren't in those studies, we couldn't get much information from it. So we don't know information about long-term follow-up effects, and we don't know information about the several key outcome areas that are really important to policyholders. And now, let's take a look at the last column, the informative news, or really the new news from this meta-analysis. So Dr. Dubois and his colleagues spent quite a bit of time talking about at-risk youth, because there were some interesting findings that youth did well when they were kind of those kids in the middle, kids with low individual risk and high environmental risk, or vice versa. But kids that were low in both types of risk or high in both types of risk didn't fare quite as well. He also found, and this has been found many other times in the past, that matching youth based on matching youth and mentors based on similar interests, again, made programs more effective. There was also some interesting news about what made programs more effective, in that if you utilized mentors with an educational or occupational background that fit your program goals, you saw better outcomes. And lastly, mentors that had either a teaching or advocacy role and in some way were supported by their program to do that also had, there was some good positive outcomes from those programs. So without further delay, let's begin the question and answer section of today's webinar. Please welcome Dr. David Dubois, Dr. Tom Keller, Michael Karcher, and Sarah Kramer to the line.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Celeste, for reviewing both this new meta-analysis and the one from 2002. I think it's important to remember that these two pieces of research, I think, build on each other in some important ways. David and Tom, I've got a lot of burning questions for you today. I'm sure our audience does as well. I'd like to encourage participants to go ahead and use that question panel there on the right-hand side of the screen to go ahead and type any questions you have for David about his research, or Tom as well. They both can speak fairly eloquently about kind of these big picture, what do we know about mentoring topics. So I think let's just get right down to it, guys. David, I just want to start at kind of a very broad picture here. This new meta-analysis has been out for a couple of months now. I know the one in 2002 was met with a little bit of, consternation perhaps by the field. I'm just curious, what's been the reaction so far? What kind of feedback are you getting from the field about this?
Thanks, Mike, and thanks just for that, stellar, from my perspective, overview of what we did find in the meta-analysis and hitting those highlights. And I'm hopeful from a standpoint of folks who aren't researchers by trade, getting a good sense of what we were able to discern, or believe we were able to discern from the data. So that was just great. In terms of reactions to date, there have been very little that I've been made aware of. It's interesting in science. The study comes out and you're excited. You bring it home and show your wife and your partner or whatever, and you're just glad to have a piece of your work finally make it to that point. They're usually several years in the making, and this was no exception. But the process of that research getting noticed and utilized by other researchers and by practitioners is typically a much slower process. And back in the 2002 analysis, I was kind of waiting for someone to maybe take notice and think this was useful, and it took quite a while, and now it is very well cited by other researchers and has made its way into things like RFPs for funding initiatives like the SEMP initiative of OJJDP, where they took 3 of those best practices and organized their RFP around innovations in those areas. So and yet that was several years after the publication. So I think it takes time in general, and also I am a complete neophyte when it comes to making inroads into the larger circle of policy and so forth. So anybody has ideas about that, I welcome it. I've reached out in the past to the Federal Mentoring Council, thinking that was a good source when Tom and myself and some other colleagues put together a policy brief, and thought maybe we could talk with them and just share what we found and what their thoughts were about how this might make sense in terms of issues to consider at least. And it kind of got a polite we'll call you later, and never heard from them. So people are busy and they've got their agendas that they're out there promoting and furthering, which are really important. And it's not always easy to stop and not smell the roses, but kind of read the research, if you will, and think about it. So there's a lot of challenges, but this type of communication that you've set up through the webinar is just a great example of what the research suggests is required for research to be utilized, and to be utilized in ways that hopefully people feel is helpful. So not a lot yet, but we'll expect that hopefully with time there'll be more utilization.
And
Sure.
if
Well,
I
I
may,
promise that those of us in the training and TA business will help you get the word out here. Tom, did you have something to add there?
yeah, first of all, thank you for inviting me to join David on the call, and I hope I can. But I wanted to commend him for being very strategic in the placement of these meta-analyses. The first one was part of a special issue of a journal devoted to youth mentoring. So there were a number of other articles, and I think that brings people to see it. And again, the choice of the publisher this time around was strategic, and I had noticed when it came out that there were several announcements that were circulated. So I think maybe the word will get out more quickly this time, and I know it's already been discussed by David and Jean at various meetings and conferences. So I think there are better channels for dissemination of information like this that we've pulled together in the field, and that's great progress.
Great. So I think let's kind of dive into the findings a little bit. And, you know, I know from a kind of a scientific method perspective, you never want to kind of know what you're looking for or think you know the answer before you start doing research. But that being said, I'm sure you had to have gone into this meta-analysis with some ideas about what you might find or were hoping to find. And so I guess my question is, you know, did anything in your findings surprise you, or were you disappointed perhaps that you didn't find something?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question, and I'll try to be brief here, and you know, because I know we want to have that interactive component to all this. But a couple things that I would mention. One, I expected to see that school-based mentoring would be less effective than community-based, just based on my own thinking, somewhat reading, the literature that I was, already aware of, in some of the higher profile, like the student mentoring program study that came out of IES that had, to be spun different ways, but evidence of relatively modest effects that were lower than those that we've seen typically in mentoring evaluations more generally. But when you really, scour the literature, and that's what we do when we do these meta-analyses, we look everywhere, not just the, high-profile publication outlets, but we really look at, quality dissertations. We look at what's called the gray literature, a lot of good research done out of, independent institutes and even state governments and so forth. When you really look at the broad spectrum, there wasn't even a hint of less effectiveness for school-based mentoring. Doesn't mean that, that's the final word, but there was nothing that just hit you over the head. And meta-analysis is a fairly crude instrument because you're analyzing, studies and trends. I love the word trend that you put in there. I think I would almost call it a trend analysis, and that suggests the level of, finality of the answers. They're really trends to be looked at and not to be viewed as the final or definitive word. So that was one surprise. And the second thing I'd say that was somewhat surprising for me was that we didn't see any improved effectiveness, that jumped out at us either over the prior generation of programs. And this by no means was, the programs that get evaluated are just a small sliver of what's going on out in the field. And, so that has to be taken into account. That was true of both meta-analyses, and so whatever, they should both be, similarly representative, or, whatever term you might apply. And there just wasn't the evidence there that we've made progress despite the efforts which have been excellent, to bring, the field into, a next generation of effective practice. I will say one last thing, though, that was interesting. It's a little bit of an inside baseball kind of detail, but I think it's noteworthy. We found less variability in effectiveness, so we wondered if perhaps the field, although maybe hasn't taken a big stride forward in terms of innovative practices to increase the overall average effects on youth, but that the level of kind of base quality and avoiding, kind of null or even negative effect sizes for youth who've been in a program looking less well off, because, the things that we could all list that could lead to that out of work of Gene Rhodes and others, like mentors not following through on their obligations and not getting the support they needed and so forth. Things that have not crept in, but really been infused into the field, I think, at this point, to the point where perhaps that's allowed programs to have more consistency in the kind of effects they're getting.
Great. That's a great point. To kind of note that programs are overall getting perhaps more consistent in their delivery. I kind of wondered if maybe the difference between, or the lack of difference between effect sizes between the two, I found myself wondering, does this mean that there's kind of a ceiling to the amount of impact mentoring can have on a young person, or are we serving riskier youth than we were before? Would either of those interpretations be part of an explanation around the effect size?
Absolutely, and that's kind of the $64,000 question, I think, is, for me anyways, I think particularly that I resonate to the first, although I think both are important, but that question of what is the ceiling here? One of the things that mentoring, has done, and many noteworthy examples is, and as a field as a whole, has moved to fairly wide dissemination, and individual programs, going to scale, as is often the term that's used, to serve larger numbers of youth. And I guess the question is, when you try to do that, move to a large scope of service, to what extent can you at the same time be improving that service? Because moving to scale, whether it be as Gene Rhodes has written about, the supermarket tomato, and when you try to get that out to every supermarket in the country, it doesn't end up, you end up squeezing it in the supermarket, because you got to look for the one that's good, right? Because something happens in the production process of going to scale versus to what extent can we be both broadly disseminated as an intervention and serve and operate and serve large numbers of youth, which is already not a cheap proposition, and enhancements, more support, more training, perhaps arranging different kinds of activity supports and resources for mentors costs money, and it's just not clear how the issues of growth and impact can be balanced out, and just what that ceiling is. I'm rambling a little bit because it's something I wrestle with, and I don't think the story is closed on that yet. I hope when we come back and look at the literature again, we will see evidence of that uptick that I was hoping to find this time.
But Mike, I have a certain interpretation on this that is just speculative, but I think I could make the case that it could be a matter of focus, and some of the findings in the meta-analysis really highlighted that when programs have a particular goal that's clearly understood by the mentors, and the mentors may be selected for their ability to help the child in a certain area, that you might get better effects. So it could be that the programs that were included in the meta-analysis measured several domains, but they were maybe really strong in one of them, and where they put most of their attention, and they were included in the analysis of those other domains where maybe there wasn't as much attention. So they're bringing down, they're raising the average effect size in the areas where they really put their efforts, but they're watering down the effect size if that wasn't their primary focus. So that can happen in an individual mentoring relationship too, right? Where because of the child's needs, they might focus on academics, but so there's not much change in social skills, or vice versa. So I think that might be one reason why we sort of see this modest effect size overall, but there might be particular programs or particular relationships where there are more noteworthy gains in more specific areas.
Yeah,
And just to add real quick,
point,
yeah, go ahead.
Oh, just, I've seen the field, I think, become a little bit more specialized over the last 5 or 10 years. And David, I thought you guys did a very nice job in your conclusion section of kind of encouraging the field to further develop specific models around, mentoring is going to be used in a more targeted way at a particular site. That site may need to have a very different theory of change, a very different logic model than what we kind of traditionally think of as the mechanisms behind mentoring.
This is Sarah. I'm going to jump in. We've got a couple questions from some of our attendees, Mike. And
sure.
Some of them, they're specifically about wanting to ask David and Tom to talk a little bit about effect sizes for specific kinds of programs. And I don't know if you can really address this given the nature of the meta-analysis, but are there differences in effects between school, community-based programs, and maybe after-school mentoring programs?
Right, that's great. And what I was trying to indicate earlier was that we did not find evidence of difference between school and community-based programs. So that was an area where, and maybe I should be specific, both showed evidence of effectiveness. So that, they showed equal levels of effectiveness. Maybe is the best way to frame that. Or differences that could not be distinguished statistically. And the after-school programs, are an interesting, let's call them other site-based programs, right? That they're site-based in some way, often after-school location or some type of CBO out there in the community. It could be a job, employer as well. And we had to kind of group things into that broader bin of they weren't community-based, which was kind of, go out and do your own thing where you'd like. They weren't school-based. They were based in some other type of site, often after-school program, but not exclusively. Those also showed evidence of effectiveness, but nothing that jumped out and you could statistically say was more or less than the other program models. And that goes to that point about flexibility, and probably also to what Tom is saying, that what your model is and what you're attempting to improve. And we haven't done the next level of data dive on all this. It could be that when you look at school academic outcomes, maybe that's a place where school-based mentoring or even after school, which often have academic kind of themes to them, programs, do better than community-based, and maybe vice versa. The community do better on some of the non-school, more psychosocial behavioral. When you compare the two public-private venture studies of Big Brothers Big Sisters, community mentoring, and now their school-based mentoring more recently, there's a hint of that pattern where maybe school-based mentoring is particularly good for the academic outcomes. Again, not to put anything into a box, but I think there's an additional level of detail here that we weren't able to get at with our first cut at the data. But we're kind of combining across all categories of outcomes and saying, does one model look better or worse?
Great, thank you.
Great. Sarah, do we have any other questions rolling in?
We have another question. It's maybe digging a little deeper than what you can get to, but a question about, Cassie has a question about impacts regarding, specifically within school-based mentoring programs, that they often have shorter match length. And was there any connection to these outcomes if school-based mentoring matches are only 9 months or less? Were you able to address any of that?
No, not in a way that I think would merit, really trying to come to any kind of conclusion that I put any stock in. One of the challenges, I thought it was this great idea to, this time around, code, and when we looked at these study reports, what percentage of the matches actually made it to their minimum length. So not just looking at program length or minimum relationship length, because it could be the case that whether it's a short or long program, that as long as everybody's on the same page and there's not a problem with shorter length programs. And in fact, when we did look at program length, we didn't see any variation that short-term programs, even sometimes like 3 months, were less effective than longer programs, with a big caveat there that very, very few studies are out there that look at a horizon of more than a year, 2 years at the outside. So that upper end of length, and I'm a firm believer that if we could have a good evaluation of mentoring delivered over a number of years, we would see better effects than shorter term program models, but that's a hypothesis. But I had this additional thought that regardless of the length, what percentage of the mentor relationships make it to that minimum length, and so to what extent is the program susceptible to diminished results because of premature endings. But unfortunately, the study reports so seldom provided the information that was needed to code that and to really say, well, how many of your relationships actually made it to X months or 9 months if it's a school-based mentoring program. We're kind of spoiled in some ways by some of the reports like that come out of PPV, which are just exemplary, exceptional in terms of the detail and clarity and comprehensiveness that they offer. And journals, are shorter venues, and frankly, just the quality. One of the jokes we have in the meta-analysis circle is if you want to feel good about yourself as a researcher, do meta-analysis, because even if you don't feel real great about how you're doing your own research, you frankly see a lot of unevenness out there, and not to be overly critical of folks, but there's just, just like you see in the field, folks who are all doing mentoring, but there's quality variations when you go to a conference or something, and you can sometimes feel good about yourself in that regard, and hey, we've got a long ways to go, but we can see we've come farther than some other folks have. And so it's, we're really hamstrung by what's out there in terms of information to address those kind of more nuanced questions. Tom, you've done some, with Julia Price, some really important research on school-based mentoring and so forth. I don't know if there's anything you'd want to add on that.
Well, first of all, it sort of goes back to that idea of focus. Some programs might be trying to accomplish a certain thing that 6 months is adequate time to achieve what they're trying to do, and everybody considers it a success at that point. So again, I emphasize that all the components of a program should really be carefully considered so that they help you to achieve what you're trying to accomplish, whether, all the factors like who the mentors are, what's the length of time, what's the amount of contact, what's the context. So it's more about how all of those moving parts fit together and make sense together to deliver the services that you want to. One thing that was interesting, though, in our study of school-based mentoring is that it was not a large sample, maybe 30 matches or so, but they all went through the full school year. So there were no early terminations. So in that respect, they were considered successful. But there was clear difference between what was happening in the relationships. Some of them sort of hit a certain level and then didn't really get any closer or stronger, and throughout the year sort of seemed a bit superficial, even though they really did fulfill their commitment. So I think maybe partly it's that the structure of school-based mentoring where they can show up. There's often a group or others, and there's less planning involved. So they saw that they could get through the school year, even if they weren't planning to go beyond that. Where community-based, I think, maybe does require a little higher level of investment, and if the mentor's not into it or something's not going well, it's more likely to close. So we sort of saw some shadow matches, I guess. I'm not completely engaged, but still sticking with it through the end of the year.
Yeah, that's interesting, Tom, and you know, I know you've done a lot of work around, you know, kind of a typology of mentoring relationships, and you know, this notion that mentors need to be kind of very attuned to what's happening with the student they're matched with, and that got me thinking about, you know, one of the other questions I had coming out of the meta-analysis having to do with that mentor role, and it's one of those moderators of program effectiveness that you found, David. You seem to indicate that the programs that place their mentors in what you termed an advocacy or teaching role seemed to have a greater impact. And I was just curious, you know, what kind of that looked like in practice? What did that advocacy look like? And did you see that in certain types of programs? Was that more prevalent in school-based or one serving kind of a juvenile justice population? Could you talk about that a little bit, please?
Sure. And I think, you know, this was an interesting area to explore, and we did not find, is almost to go with these findings, it's important to kind of note what we didn't find. When we looked at programs that were organized around having the mentors facilitate the delivery of a pretty specific set of curricula, you know, and lessons. Like there's one program I can think of that, you know, where the mentor in a community-based model, you know, goes through a series of 7 kind of activity sessions with the youth around anger management and violence prevention issues, which, you know, it's on the face of it, you know, really potentially interesting and positive model to think about how a mentor can make a particular impact. This is a program, to Tom's point, that was with kids who came to the ER, referred to the program from there with injuries due to some type of altercation with peers. So it would be right in line with what these kids might benefit from. But when you looked at highly structured curricular, you know, overlays, we didn't see any evidence that they were more effective. But so it doesn't seem like there needs to be. That's not the route that is necessary. But what we did see better effectiveness for was when it was really clear that if you ask the mentor, you know, so to speak, what is your purpose or you know, set of objectives here in terms of the areas of the young person's development that you're hoping to provide benefit for, that they would be able to answer that, and they'd have some strategies in hand for actually how to realize those goals. So one program around obesity prevention used, you know, college student volunteer mentors who received, you know, quite a bit of training, but then also had some pretty good, you know, activity guides for working with youth around that concept. And they, you know, and this was in a, you know, challenging urban context around, you know, probably finding areas for, you know, getting kids access to healthy food and exercise would not always be the simplest thing for a mentor to facilitate. And they found really nice evidence of impact there. So those are the kind of programs that we're seeing the better evidence of effect for, kind of mentoring with the purpose, if you will. And I think if there's a bottom line, and this is just reading trends, right? I don't have the answers here. I don't want to come across this if I do. But reading the trends in the literature, it seems to me that the field may have gone too far with avoiding the dangers of prescriptive mentoring in terms of the mentor who comes along and has an agenda for the youth and kind of drives that through the relationship, you know, heck or high water, you know, not reading the cues of the youth and taking the time for relationship development before you even begin to interject, you know, your ideas about what could be beneficial. That has been taken to the point, I think, in my view, where there hasn't been sufficient attention given to the benefits to artfully working in more purposeful kinds of interactions and activities into the mentoring relationship, which can involve a teaching component or a guidance component around things like healthy lifestyle, but could be around your academic success or, you know, peer relations or what have you, or even an area that's established specific specifically to that youth based on the kind of goal setting process you folks do, many of you in your programs already, but really then giving the mentor a set of activity guides or ongoing support that's really very mindful of what they might be trying to most focus on. So, and the advocacy, I'll just say real quickly, because that I think bears at least some mention, because it's something that I think is particularly new concept to probably many mentoring programs in terms of, or one that is somewhat controversial in terms of thinking about, because it can also raise issues of role boundaries for mentors. Is this mentor becoming over-involved, so to speak, in a young person's life in a way that might raise a red flag in terms of whether this is going to be a beneficial and even a safe relationship? So that's important. But again, I think the field may have over-attended to that, or at least needs to couple that with the idea that carefully structured and supported by the program, that allowing that mentor to take a more action-oriented role to help the youth address some of the needs that the youth might have for getting involved in different kinds of activities, partnering with parents, like in the Blue Ribbon program down in North Carolina, where the mentors, garden variety, community volunteers are tasked with partnering with parents to do things like, write a letter to the youth's teachers at the beginning of the school year saying that you're here working with the parent and ready to be of help in any way you could, going to a parent-teacher conference with the parent to support them, reviewing the youth's report cards and talking with them about how things are going in school. And those are the kinds of things that are really in the area of advocacy. You're really trying to interact with other institutions and individuals that are key in that youth's life, and to make sure their needs are being met as much as possible. It's a whole new horizon for mentoring programs to at least consider, along with the teaching and guidance. The issues of prescriptive mentoring, role boundaries, always have to be there. But from my standpoint, I think that there should be a dialectic of kind of thinking about those concerns, along with the upside of artfully blending in more guidance and more advocacy.
Great. Thanks for kind of clarifying that, David. And a lot of what you just said kind of reminds me of the recent work of Mike Karcher and Mike Knuckle around, I think they kind of have concluded that it doesn't matter really whether you start from this very developmental relationship focus or kind of start maybe with some instrumental things, that all roads lead to the same place. If you start instrumentally, you can build a relationship while you do that. Or conversely, if you start by building a relationship, that opens the doorway to doing that more instrumental work with each other. Sarah, real quick, do we have any participant questions?
We have quite a few, and I think some of them are not exactly. I think someone sounds like they have a Caribbean steel drum band passing by, but so I think it's okay for now. A lot of the questions seem to be maybe a little bit not exactly focused on the scope of the meta-analysis, so I'm going to skip some of those. But we do have some questions coming in, and I want to make sure we address it before the end of the webinar. Did you, and I know you kind of talked about general impacts and the effect sizes, but are there any specific practices that you found that really make a good quality program? Is there anything we can take away from this as programs to implement into our existing structures so that we can do a better job?
Right. Thanks, Sarah. I would say that I'm going to frame these as things that deserve careful consideration, because I think, to Tom's point about the specificity and uniqueness of each program, what I really encourage, and I'm preaching to the choir, because the folks you wouldn't be on this webinar if you weren't, seeing value and taking time out of your, already full schedules to say, let me touch base with some of the research going on. But with that, that acknowledgement, to really challenge yourself. And it's so easy to look at all of us look at anything like a research study and say, oh, that confirms my perception here and there. These other things don't. Let me just, not pay so much attention to those. So I'd kind of encourage folks to really, if not formally, informally do a kind of a best practices audit for their program, keeping in mind their logic model, as Tom was referring to, and what their goals are, and thinking, gosh, to this list that's up on the screen right now, from the earlier meta-analysis, as well as the things coming out of the new one, let's think about it and not be defensive because we haven't done it, but let's really think, is there a way that we could build, for example, more of a teaching and guidance role into the mentoring relationship? Should we try that for 6 months with half our matches and kind of see how it goes? Here in Chicago, the Big Brothers Big Sisters agency has been working over a number of years to incrementally build in more of that kind of intentionality to the mentoring, all the while sticking true to the more developmental model that Big Brothers Big Sisters adheres to. So I think it's really that I'd encourage not a particular practice, but a really a thoughtful, considered, non-defensive kind of internal discussion. This isn't to your external audiences, right? Just you're internally saying, hey, what are we doing well? What are we not doing so well? You could almost take these practices from the 2 reviews and have everybody independently, kind of rate and come to the meeting with some comments about what you think you do well and not well. And then you look at what do our resources and our goals permit as areas, hey, we want to keep this going. We all agree we're doing a good job. The research suggests it's important. Ongoing training for mentors, for example, thinking of all the work that your group does, Sarah, on that topic. So that could be a strength, but then you might say, gosh, we're not really providing these kind of structured activities for the matches to come together and be facilitated in their development. So what could we do more there? So I really think, that's where I hate to say any one practice. We don't have the kind of evidence, I would say, that any one practice is, oh, if you don't do this, you're really on thin ice. And so I think they're more, and they're probably fungible. If you do in one practice, then maybe another one becomes less important. So if you're doing really great upfront training, the ongoing training might be less important. But if you don't do a lot of upfront training, maybe the ongoing training is really more important. So you have to kind of look at the totality. Again, as Tom was saying, fitting all the pieces together. I will say one thing that we haven't mentioned that came out of the current meta-analysis, which is probably something that is going on, a lot already in programs, but doesn't always occur, is making a special effort to match on similarity of interest. And that's something, particularly in school-based mentoring, because I know a number of folks that it seems like on the call or on the webinar are thinking about that model. There can be, from my experience anyways, from what I've seen, a time pressure to getting those programs launched at the beginning of the year, and a sense that maybe you've got fewer degrees of freedom. You've got one set of mentors maybe from a company or from a school, from a college, and you've got this group of kids who and so you got to get the program going. Are you really doing everything you can to pay attention to that? So that is something that I think is one to think about. But I think more generally, I'd really argue for that best practices audit, where you really you take these lists and whatever other sources you think might be useful. In school-based mentoring, I would highly recommend Gene Rhodes's and Grossman's recent Test of Time paper, which raised provocative questions about whether you should even be rematching matches during the school year that close, because they found some less positive outcomes when matches closed and were rematched relative to staying open. So I think it's that kind of critical internal dialogue, knowing your program as you do, and is what I most forcefully recommend.
So I would add in that regard. I completely agree with what David was saying, that maybe the most important thing is to think about your staff and the people that are going to sit down and think through those issues with you, and their level of experience, the kind of training that they're able to attend, and really you know, even things like David was saying with the matching, you know, somebody who can sort of have that deeper sense of how two people are going to be compatible, the mentor and the youth, and just has that sense of how the match can be made. So I think one thing that's not in the meta-analysis but we need to address as a field is the you know, not professionalization of the field, but just the valuing the role of the staff and their expertise, and you know, their understanding of the research, their understanding of the programs, and the experience that they gain on the job. I see, you know, the biggest worry for me in the field is the level of turnover. So that would be on my list of best practices, is to pay some attention to keeping the really strong people in your program, and helping them to develop and be more effective in their jobs. And I think then you can really have those kind of conversations that David was talking about with people who have great insight, great experience, and really know what it's going to take to be effective in your program.
This is April, and just what you both said in response to that question made me think of the research and action briefs that you did. And so for those beginners who are participating today, or anybody who wants a refresher, we'll include that in the email, a link to those, just talking about, you know, the importance of the staff, and then also just looking at your own evidence for best practices. And I popped up the Mentoring Partnerships website about our quality mentoring assessment path, not just as shameless promotion. I was just going to ask, you know, just to kind of to push that question a little bit more than too about, because in our conversations as partners, as we've been planning this webinar, just, you know, kind of thinking that it's not like the 2011, the new meta-analysis, you know, that these best practices that were emerged from 2002, those are still relevant. You know, that's what I'm hearing you saying, but I think there's been some confusion about, well, if those weren't significant, or if we, you know, if this meta-analysis or the paper isn't mentioning those particular best practices, are those still relevant now, or are we only looking at the things that have shown up in 2011? But, you know, just a little clarity there, because we even suggested in our conversations, I think, others, you know, that have we moved beyond that discussion of evidence-based practice? Do our mentoring programs really, do we need to be convinced that those things are necessary anymore, or is it more we're moving beyond that and trying to find kind of tweaking beyond just those basic best practices?
Yeah, thanks, April. That I think it's really, I'm really glad you raised that for consideration, and your quality assessment package or pathway. I didn't quite hear what the term was. That sounds like a great resource for folks. I hope, you know, folks will check that out. With regard to the practices, that, you know, researchers thrive on variability. We can't understand how one thing goes with anything else if that one thing, like let's say ongoing training for mentors, if it doesn't vary across, in this case, the studies that we looked at, we can't detect whether it matters, whether it's there or not. If it's there everywhere, you don't have any point of comparison. And so what we found in looking at the two sets of studies was that, as one would expect, given some of the things we talked about today, what we all know, and most of us on this call, you know, webinar be aware of, the field's development, is that those core practices like providing training to mentors, screening and background checks for mentors, you know, providing some structured activities for the matches to facilitate their development, those have all become notably more commonplace in the field, which is great. But from a research standpoint, it makes it much harder to detect whether they matter, because they become more you know, fundamental to what's going on, and you don't have a lot of points of comparison. So that, going back to that idea of the unevenness in the quality that seemed to be there in the earlier generation of programs, from a research standpoint, that allowed us to detect more reliably the importance of some of these fundamental practices, and absolutely would not want anybody to look at the current results and think that those are not, are indicating that these more core practices are no longer important. And to add to that, meta-analysis is a very crude instrument. While I'm, just so pleased that the kind of work that my colleagues and I have done in this area, is something that the field feels is worth, really taking a look at. It is not a process that leads to definitive, take it to the bank, this is what mentoring programs need or not need to be doing. It is a source of information and evidence that we hope people will critically reflect on in a non-defensive, not just look for confirmation for what you're doing, but that non-defensive, open piece. But other than that, then, realize that there's a lot of caveats like those I just mentioned. And I think that, and some of these practices, I'm thinking of Sarah's work with youth safety and the resources that, her institute's been at the forefront of developing. We may never be able to detect the importance of those in a meta-analysis because we're not, you can't measure in this kind of approach, even in a single evaluation often, the cost of even one youth, ending up being, intentionally harmed by a mentor. So, some of those practices we looked at, like screening mentors, there's just no way to ever really, from a research standpoint, in this kind of modality anyways, document that they're important. And, we have to rely on professional, wisdom and judgment and community, based, funder sensibilities about some of these things that are important. So it's a big picture. Research is one part of the conversation. That's all.
Great, thank you. And I know, Mike, you've got we have a lot of questions that that we had Mike ready to answer, and I realize we're getting close to our time, and we have a couple audience questions that are aligned with some of your questions, Mike. So do you mind if I just jump in and focus in on a couple of those?
How about it?
Okay, so a couple people are asking about a specific question that we also thought of is how do you take, and there are lots of other really great questions, and I'm sorry to everyone that we won't get to ask all of these, but the idea that how can we use the findings from this meta-analysis and all of the other work to help funders realize what's important with mentoring programs, and how can they support mentoring programs beyond just 1 year? Because as you know, sometimes programs, they get started and then suddenly their funding dries up. Well, it's probably not very suddenly, but their funding dries up, and then they no longer have the resources to support matches, which in turn has a negative impact on those youth. So what can we all do to help to educate funders about the importance of all of these quality factors in supporting the youth mentoring programs?
Yeah, thank you for that, because I was hoping we could get to the external audience type of communications that might be supported by the meta-analysis. I've focused a lot on just what I've been saying about the internal dialogue you might have. Facing outward, one of the things that I think came out of this, and I'm glad that you folks, the organizers noted that you thought this was interesting and useful, was looking at whether mentoring programs can impact more than one area of a young person's development. I think this is really an important strategic niche, if you will, for mentoring programs to play up. And I'm glad that we were able to find some evidence to support it. It's not something that is a new idea to the field, that's for sure, but it's just bringing some data to bear on that supports it. Whereas, you might face a funder who says, why shouldn't I just do a tutoring program? That's going to, isn't that going to do more to raise my, at-risk students' reading scores and so forth? And to be honest with you, it might. It certainly would probably do as well, but might, if you read the meta-analysis in that area, I would probably put my money on that. However, this is what I would also say to that principal. Say, if that's your sole goal, is to improve reading, and that's just what you want to do, and that's that's your that's it. Then you have a point that's really important to consider. However, if you're interested in promoting your students' overall development and well-being, both with regard to academics, their attitudes towards school, even coming to school on a regular basis, their sense of confidence as they approach their schoolwork, and even areas outside of school, but they impact on their academics, their self-esteem, their involvement in at-risk behavior, then mentoring has been shown to impact all those areas where, as an example, tutoring has not. So if you're interested in the child's holistic development, I'm being somewhat facetious here, right? Because like, who answers that question? No, right? Hopefully, so I think that's one dialogue you can have in a nice way, but is to make them almost tell you they don't want to promote holistic development. And the second thing I would say is that, well, second thing real quickly is a lot of the interventions, even though there's more and more research coming out on many types of interventions, a lot of the ones you'll see out there that won't have this kind of, extensive research support behind them. So I do think it's reasonable to kind of say, well, what's your meta-analysis for your, alternative, that you're thinking, the funding should go towards. And the third thing I'd say regarding the length of programs, sustaining programs over time, and thereby relationships as well, I wish I had more I could say. I wish we had those studies of multiple years and what happens both when programs are withdrawn by design or due to unexpected developments or sustained. I think there's a real story to be told there, and it's the kind of story that you're outlining in terms of how it might impact youth, Sarah. But the data for that, I can't really. There's not enough there in the literature as a whole to point to big trends because the studies just haven't been done. We need to do these longer. That's on us as researchers to do these longer-term follow-up studies to look at what happens. And some of the studies that even have planful withdrawals, the few that are out there, do suggest the effects go away for youth when you don't have mentoring. But it's so early. We don't have enough to make a big conclusion based on our overall evaluation of the literature.
Well, and David, the other thing to think about is doing multiple short-term evaluations on the same program. I don't know if that's ever been done. Like we were talking before, has there been change or movement in the field since the first meta-analysis? Well, if we went back to one of those original programs that was evaluated 10 years ago and did the same kind of study, even if it was only 6 months or a year or whatever, would they have achieved stronger effects now? Because, again, we hope that programs are learning and improving over time with their experience. So that's another way we could get at it. But again, to the original question, I would say David has been typically modest in pointing to what a meta-analysis can or can't do. He's talked about some of the limitations, but it really is an immensely helpful piece of the research because it provides that central answer that is usually the first stage in working with a policymaker or funder, where they say, well, does mentoring work? And I think that this kind of work, this kind of meta-analysis gives a lot of weight in answering that question, that what all of these 73 programs had in common is that definition of mentoring. So that, you can make a strong point, is effective overall. Again, there are many variations, several permutations, a lot of variability, but again, there's a lot of evidence, and this replicates the early meta-analysis to say that whatever is core about mentoring, there's something to it. And so then you can get beyond that initial stage in the conversation and say, well, yes, there are some programs stronger than others, and we can do things better if we use certain practices. It's important to look for the stronger programs in funding decisions. But this really gets you through that first hoop better than, like David said, some other programs that don't have a similar amount of research backing them up. So it's great that he's pulled it together, and I think you can feel more comfortable in saying with confidence, yes, mentoring is an effective strategy.
Great, and I think that we're just about at the time.
Yes,
April, did you have a couple last announcements here?
Yeah, I just decided it was more important to keep listening to David and Tom than to hear me, so did some chatting. But just popped up some information about our next webinar next month, February 16th. Lots of us have had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Roger Georgiou recently, and so this will be kind of our practice focus, and really the title may change as we get closer, but really that's our focus, and tapping into Roger's expertise in working with some of our high-risk or system-involved youth. And again, thanks to Tom, some of us have had access to him at the Summer Institute and or in other places. David and Tom, thank you so much. I did in the chat function then too tell our hundreds of participants that some of their unanswered questions will continue to inform the topics for our future webinars. But this was such a wonderful way to kick off the series, and we're so excited to have both of you, and you really I think epitomized the kind of collaboration that we want and the kind of information. And David mentioned that Roger's evaluations of AIM are in the meta-analysis, so that's perfect. I should have known that and said that myself. Thanks, David. Let's see. So just again, you will receive an email this afternoon that includes the slides, and they have a lot of some links embedded within them. I'm hoping, crossing my fingers for that online recording of the webinar, and other resources like the research and action briefs that I mentioned, and our contact information. And again, we'll have a short 5-question survey as you exit the webinar, which also includes a place where you can make suggestions for future topics. Anything else, partners? Mike, Sarah? Oh, and I'll also include the information about how to join David's listserv. And really, you just email David to say that you want to join the listserv. So those are the instructions. So I'll make sure that that's spelled out there in the email. Yeah, Sarah, Celeste, Mike, thank you so much. Any final thoughts? I was just going to end with happy National Mentoring Month, and the hope to see some of our attendees and some of you at the National Mentoring Summit next week.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, David and Tom. And the Friends for Youth Conference is coming up in February, so find out more information there. We're having another youth mentoring researcher, Dr. Tim Cavell, is going to be our keynote speaker. And I'll be at the summit next week too, so I hope to see everyone there.
Thank you.
Opportunity to do this. Great.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank everyone. We'll see you in February.